In a peaceful suburban neighborhood of Cedar Heights, where manicured lawns stretched behind white picket fences, lived Officer Christopher Reynolds, a 45-year-old veteran police officer who had recently been appointed as the city's new police chief. Having served the force for over 2 decades, his dedication and commitment to community policing had earned him this prestigious position. As the morning sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Christopher began moving boxes into his new home, a charming 2-story colonial house he had purchased after years of saving. The neighborhood was known for its tight-knit community, where block parties and neighborhood watches were common occurrences. However, not everyone welcomed change with open arms. Mrs. Patricia Henderson, a 68-year-old resident who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, watched from her window with growing suspicion. She had always taken pride in being the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's character. The sight of a new neighbor moving in without her prior knowledge disturbed her carefully maintained sense of control. As Christopher unloaded his police academy photographs and family pictures, Patricia's anxiety grew. She had grown accustomed to knowing everyone in the neighborhood, and this unexpected arrival made her uncomfortable. Without making any attempt to welcome her new neighbor or introduce herself, she reached for her phone. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. Yes, there's a suspicious man moving things into the Thompsons' old house, Patricia reported, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. I've never seen him before, and he's been going in and out of the house for hours. I think we need someone to check this out. Little did Patricia know that her call would set off a chain of events that would not only change her perspective but also impact the entire community. As police cruisers approached the quiet street with their lights flashing, Christopher was arranging his living room furniture, completely unaware of the commotion his presence had caused. The responding officers, Officers Rodriguez and Chen, stepped out of their patrol car, immediately recognizing their new chief. Their expressions shifted from professional concern to barely concealed amusement as they approached the house. Christopher, hearing the familiar sound of police radios, stepped onto his porch, still holding a family photo album. Is everything all right, officers? He asked, though the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth suggested he had already guessed the nature of their visit. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. Yes, Chief. We received a call about a suspicious person at this address. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. From her window, Patricia watched the interaction unfold, her face growing pale as she realized her mistake. The suspicious man she had reported was wearing a police academy t-shirt, and the officers were treating him with obvious respect. Her stomach dropped as she pieced together the situation. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours, several neighbors who had witnessed the incident began gathering on their porches, discussing the event in hushed tones. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others wondered how to make amends for their neighbor's hasty judgment. As the day drew to a close, Christopher sat on his porch, sipping coffee and reflecting on the day's events. He had encountered similar situations throughout his career, but this time felt different. As the new police chief, he saw an opportunity to transform this uncomfortable incident into a teachable moment for the community. The first day in his new home had certainly not gone as planned, but Christopher knew that change often came with resistance. As he watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, he began formulating plans for community outreach programs that would help bridge the gaps between neighbors and break down the barriers of prejudice that still lingered in even the most seemingly peaceful neighborhoods. This incident would become the catalyst for a series of events that would reshape not only Patricia's worldview but the entire community's approach to welcoming new neighbors, regardless of their appearance or background. The story of the new police chief and his unwelcoming neighbor was just beginning, and the lessons it would teach would resonate far beyond the borders of Cedar Heights. The morning after the incident, Cedar Heights buzzed with activity as neighbors gathered in small groups, discussing the previous day's events. Christopher, now dressed in his formal police chief uniform, stepped out of his house to head to his first official day at the department headquarters. He paused briefly, noticing how conversations hushed as he walked past groups of onlookers. Patricia spent a restless night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the embarrassing scene. Through her curtains, she could see concerned looks from passing neighbors, people she'd known for years now regarding her with a mixture of disappointment and awkwardness. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her conscience, especially after learning that community leaders had organized an emergency neighborhood meeting to address the incident. At the police station, Christopher settled into his new office, surrounded by congratulatory flowers and cards from colleagues. As he reviewed department files, his secretary informed him about numerous calls from local news outlets seeking comments about the previous day's incident. Someone had posted a video of the police response on social media, and it had quickly gained traction. "Chief, the mayor's office called. They're concerned about potential negative publicity," his secretary explained, placing another stack of messages on his desk. Christopher leaned back in his chair, thinking about how to handle the situation. His years of experience had taught him that escalating tensions rarely solved problems. Instead of feeding into the drama, he began drafting a different kind of response, one that would focus on community healing rather than punishment or public shame. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Patricia received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Lee, the elderly community association president, stood at her door with a stern expression. "Patricia, we need to talk about what happened yesterday," she said firmly, her usually warm voice carrying an edge of disappointment. Inside Patricia's meticulously kept living room, Mrs. Lee didn't mince words. "Do you realize the harm you've caused? Not just to our new neighbor, but to our community's reputation?" She placed a tablet on the coffee table, showing Patricia the growing social media storm surrounding the incident. Patricia's hands trembled as she scrolled through comments condemning her actions. I didn't mean to cause such trouble," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've always looked out for this neighborhood. It's been my home for so long." "Looking out for the neighborhood doesn't mean assuming the worst in people," Mrs. Lee replied gently. "Times have changed, Patricia. Maybe it's time for us to change too." As the day progressed, Christopher received an unexpected call from the city council. They wanted to use this incident as a launching point for a new community integration program. Rather than letting the situation divide the neighborhood, they saw an opportunity to bring people together. That evening, as Christopher drove home, he noticed Patricia standing alone in her garden, looking lost and withdrawn. The once proud neighborhood watchdog now seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of public scrutiny. Making a decision that would surprise many, he pulled into his driveway and walked over to her fence. "Good evening," he called out, his voice friendly but professional. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced. I'm Christopher Reynolds." Patricia froze, her gardening tools clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She hadn't expected him to speak to her, let alone initiate a conversation. I'm Patricia Henderson," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those are beautiful roses you're tending," Christopher commented, gesturing to her prized flower bed. "My mother used to grow the same variety." This simple observation about her beloved roses, something she had nurtured for years, cracked the tension slightly. Patricia's shoulders relaxed a fraction as she looked at her flowers. "They're heritage roses," she said softly. "They need special care, but they're worth it." "Sometimes the things that need the most care turn out to be the most valuable," Christopher replied, the meaning in his words extending beyond just gardening. "I'm hosting a neighborhood coffee morning this weekend. It would mean a lot if you could come. I make a mean apple pie, old family recipe." Before Patricia could respond, several neighbors walking their dogs passed by, watching the interaction with obvious curiosity. The sight of the new police chief casually chatting with the woman who had called the police on him created quite a stir. As Christopher walked back to his house, he could hear the immediate buzz of phone calls and messages being sent throughout the neighborhood. His simple act of kindness would soon become the talk of Cedar Heights, but not in the way anyone expected. This conversation in Patricia's garden would mark the beginning of an unexpected friendship that would challenge everyone's preconceptions about forgiveness, change, and the true meaning of community. The sun set on Cedar Heights, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and well-tended gardens. In two neighboring houses, two very different people prepared for dinner, one wrestling with shame and regret, the other planning how to turn an unfortunate incident into an opportunity for growth. Neither knew that their story was about to become a powerful lesson in redemption that would reach far beyond their quiet suburban street. The weekend arrived with a crisp morning breeze carrying the inviting aroma of freshly baked apple pie and brewing coffee from Christopher's house. He had spent the early hours preparing for the neighborhood coffee morning, arranging chairs in his backyard and setting up a welcoming space that he hoped would encourage open conversation. One by one, neighbors began arriving, each carrying dishes of homemade treats and barely concealed curiosity. The local teacher brought her famous blueberry muffins, while the retired doctor from 2 doors down contributed a plate of chocolate chip cookies. The atmosphere was tentative at first, with small groups forming and whispered conversations taking place behind raised coffee cups. Patricia stood at her window, watching the gathering crowd. She had spent the morning trying on different outfits, picking them up and putting them down again, unsure whether to attend. The invitation card Christopher had dropped in her mailbox sat on her kitchen counter, its simple message seeming to mock her indecision: "Everyone is welcome. No exceptions." Back at the gathering, Christopher noticed the subtle divisions forming among his guests. Some neighbors were clearly uncomfortable, stealing glances at Patricia's empty house while others spoke in hushed tones about the incident. Taking action, he gently tapped his coffee cup with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice warm and sincere. "You know, in my 20 years of police work, I've learned that the strongest communities are built not when everything is perfect, but when we face our challenges together." As he spoke, a slight movement caught his eye. Patricia had emerged from her house, wearing her Sunday best, clutching a covered dish. She stood hesitantly at the edge of her property, like a swimmer testing water temperature with their toe. Without missing a beat, Christopher continued, "And speaking of together, Mrs. Henderson's famous lemon squares would make this morning complete. Would someone mind helping her carry that dish over?" Mrs. Lee, understanding the significance of the moment, immediately walked over to Patricia. Other neighbors watched as the two women made their way to the gathering, some with surprise, others with relief. The tension in the air began to dissolve like morning mist under the rising sun. As Patricia set her lemon squares on the dessert table, Christopher approached her with a cup of coffee, prepared exactly as he had noticed she liked it from their garden conversation, with a splash of cream and no sugar. This small detail wasn't lost on Patricia, whose hands shook slightly as she accepted the cup. "I suppose everyone's talking about what a fool I made of myself," Patricia said quietly, her eyes fixed on her coffee. "Actually," Christopher replied, "we were just about to discuss the neighborhood watch program I'm planning to implement. Given your experience in observing the neighborhood, I'd value your input on how we can make it more effective and inclusive." Several neighbors who overheard this exchange shared surprised looks. Christopher wasn't just offering an olive branch, he was extending an opportunity for Patricia to transform her previous actions into something positive for the community. The conversation gradually shifted to community improvement ideas. The local schoolteacher suggested after-school programs that could bring families together. The retired doctor proposed health awareness workshops. Even Patricia, finding her voice, shared insights about creating a community garden where neighbors could work together and share their harvests. As the morning progressed, something remarkable happened. The invisible barriers that had divided the gathering began to fade. People who had lived as neighbors for years but barely spoke to each other found common ground in their desires to improve their community. A touching moment came when young Tommy, the 8-year-old from across the street, approached Patricia with a plate of apple pie. "Chief Reynolds says you like gardening," he said shyly. "Would you teach me how to grow tomatoes? Mom says our backyard is just collecting weeds." Patricia's eyes welled up with tears as she looked at Christopher, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Well," she said, her voice stronger now, "we could start with cherry tomatoes. They're easier for beginners, and they're as sweet as candy when they're fresh off the vine." The morning stretched into afternoon, and what had started as an awkward gathering transformed into a genuine community celebration. Plans were made for future events, a monthly community dinner, a neighborhood cleanup day, and yes, a community garden project led by Patricia herself. As the last guests began to leave, carrying empty dishes and full hearts, Christopher noticed Patricia lingering behind, helping to stack chairs. The woman who had called the police on him just days ago was now working alongside him, their shared task a symbol of how far things had come in such a short time. "Thank you," Patricia said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for inviting me, but for showing me a better way to protect our neighborhood, by bringing it together instead of keeping people out." Christopher smiled, understanding that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. The story of Cedar Heights was far from over, but it had taken an unexpected turn toward hope, understanding, and the possibility of genuine change. As weeks passed, Cedar Heights underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The community garden project, spearheaded by Patricia and supported by Christopher, had broken ground in a previously unused lot between their homes. What was once an eyesore of overgrown weeds was now becoming a symbol of community renewal. On a particularly warm Saturday morning, Patricia found herself surrounded by neighborhood children, including young Tommy, teaching them how to properly plant seedlings. Her hands, once used to dial the police in suspicion, now gently guided smaller ones in patting soil around tender plants. Christopher often paused during his morning coffee to watch the scene from his porch, marveling at how naturally Patricia had stepped into her role as the garden's mentor. "Remember," Patricia instructed her young audience, "these plants are like new neighbors. They need time, care, and acceptance to grow strong." The metaphor wasn't lost on the adults within earshot, who shared knowing smiles. The local newspaper had gotten wind of the neighborhood's transformation story. A reporter arrived one morning to interview both Christopher and Patricia, intrigued by how an incident that could have divided the community had instead united it. The reporter found them working side by side in the garden, Patricia showing Christopher how to stake tomato plants properly. "You know," Christopher said to the reporter, wiping sweat from his brow, "sometimes the best policing isn't about enforcement at all. It's about building bridges and nurturing connections." He glanced at Patricia, who was nodding in agreement while adjusting a plant support. The reporter scribbled furiously, clearly sensing a story that went deeper than the initial viral video. "And Mrs. Henderson, how do you feel about everything that's happened since that day?" Patricia paused, carefully considering her words. "I used to think protecting our neighborhood meant keeping people out. Now I understand it means bringing people together." She gestured to the thriving garden beds. "Look at these plants. They're stronger because they grow together, supporting each other." As the interview continued, more neighbors began arriving for the day's gardening session. The community garden had become a gathering place where age, background, and past misunderstandings seemed to dissolve among the rows of growing vegetables and flowers. Mrs. Lee, who had originally confronted Patricia about her actions, now regularly brought her famous lemonade for the gardeners. She watched as Patricia patiently taught a group of teenagers how to identify beneficial insects from garden pests. "Who would have thought," Mrs. Lee mused to Christopher, "that our neighborhood watchdog would become our community builder?" The transformation wasn't limited to the garden. Christopher had successfully implemented his new community policing program, with Patricia serving as a key advisor. Her attention to detail and knowledge of the neighborhood, once channeled into suspicion, now helped create effective community safety initiatives that brought people together instead of driving them apart. One evening, as the sun set over Cedar Heights, Christopher hosted a community dinner in his backyard. The table was laden with dishes made from the garden's first harvest, Patricia's tomato salad taking center stage. The conversation flowed easily among neighbors who, just months ago, had been awkward strangers. During dinner, Tommy stood up unexpectedly, holding a small pot with a flowering plant. "Mrs. Henderson," he announced proudly, "this is from all of us kids in the garden club. It's a heritage rose, like the ones in your yard. Because you've taught us that even thorny things can make beautiful flowers." Patricia's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the gift. The same neighbors who had once whispered about her in disapproval now applauded warmly. Christopher raised his glass in a toast. "To growth," he said simply, "in all its forms." After dinner, as neighbors helped clean up, Patricia pulled Christopher aside. "You know," she said quietly, "when you first moved in, I was afraid of change. I didn't realize change could be so beautiful." Christopher smiled, remembering their first uncomfortable encounter. "Sometimes the best changes are the ones we resist the most," he replied, watching as children played tag around the garden beds they'd helped plant. As night fell over Cedar Heights, the garden stood as a testament to transformation, not just of a vacant lot, but of hearts and minds. The neighborhood had learned that true security comes not from walls and suspicion, but from understanding and connection. The story of the police chief and his once suspicious neighbor had evolved into something much larger, a lesson in how communities can grow stronger through acceptance, forgiveness, and the willingness to nurture change, just like the carefully tended plants in their shared garden. The story of Cedar Heights' transformation began attracting attention beyond the local newspaper. A regional news station picked up the story, fascinated by how a potentially divisive incident had blossomed into a model for community healing. Their news van arrived early one morning, just as Christopher and Patricia were setting up for the garden's first harvest festival. "I never thought I'd be doing television interviews," Patricia confided to Christopher as they arranged pumpkins and squash on display tables. "Especially not about something like this." She smoothed her apron nervously, the fabric decorated with small embroidered vegetables, a gift from the neighborhood sewing circle. The festival grounds buzzed with activity. Children darted between tables laden with fresh produce, their faces painted with butterflies and flowers. The retired doctor had set up a booth about healthy eating, featuring recipes using garden vegetables. Near the entrance, Mrs. Lee coordinated a team of volunteers distributing maps showing the festival attractions. The news crew filmed as Christopher led a tour of the garden, explaining how the community project had grown beyond its original scope. "What started as a simple garden has become a living classroom," he explained, gesturing to a group of elementary school students tending their adopted plot. "We're not just growing vegetables, we're growing understanding." During the interview, Patricia shared her own journey of transformation. "You know," she said, her voice steadied despite the camera, "I used to spend my days watching people through my window, always suspicious, always afraid. Now I spend them watching things grow, plants, friendships, community spirit." The festival reached its emotional peak when the mayor arrived to present Cedar Heights with an award for community excellence. Standing on a small makeshift stage, he held up their story as an example of how neighborhoods could transform conflict into cooperation. In a time when many communities are being torn apart by misunderstanding and fear, the mayor announced, "Cedar Heights shows us another way forward." He turned to Christopher and Patricia, who stood side by side. "Your story reminds us that change begins with a single act of courage, whether that's admitting a mistake or extending forgiveness." As the crowd applauded, Tommy tugged at Patricia's sleeve. "Mrs. Henderson," he whispered excitedly, "can we show them our special project?" Patricia looked at Christopher, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they led the news crew to a secluded corner of the garden. There, surrounded by carefully tended flowers, stood a new addition, a handmade bench with a plaque reading, "The Friendship Bench," where strangers become neighbors. The kids came up with the idea, Patricia explained, her voice thick with emotion. They said every garden needs a place where people can sit and talk until they understand each other better. She ran her hand along the bench's smooth surface, remembering how far she'd come from that day when she'd reached for her phone in fear. The news reporter, touched by the symbol's significance, asked Christopher about his decision to respond to the initial incident with kindness rather than confrontation. In law enforcement, we often see the worst in people, he reflected. But sometimes, what looks like prejudice is really just fear of the unknown. The real challenge is finding the courage to bridge that gap. As the festival continued into the afternoon, neighbors shared meals at long tables set up between the garden rows. Children proudly served salads made with vegetables they'd grown themselves. The once quiet streets of Cedar Heights echoed with laughter and conversation. Later, as the sun began to set, Patricia and Christopher found themselves sitting on the friendship bench, watching the last festival-goers depart. "Did you ever imagine," Patricia asked, "that your first day in the neighborhood would lead to all this?" Christopher chuckled. "Actually, when I first moved in, I was worried about fitting in. I thought being the new police chief might make neighbors uncomfortable." He gestured to the thriving garden around them. "I never expected to find such a strong partner in building community." A group of children ran past, their arms full of harvest vegetables to take home. "Mrs. Henderson," they called out, waving. "See you tomorrow for the composting lesson." Patricia waved back, then turned to Christopher with tears in her eyes. "You know what the most beautiful part is? These children will grow up knowing that it's never too late to change, to learn, to become better. They'll remember the garden where a mistake turned into a miracle." As darkness settled over Cedar Heights, the garden's solar lights flickered on, casting a gentle glow over the paths and plants. The friendship bench sat as a quiet sentinel, ready to welcome anyone seeking connection. The story of Cedar Heights continued to grow, like the carefully tended plants in their garden, proving that even the rockiest soil can yield the sweetest harvest when cultivated with care and understanding. As autumn painted Cedar Heights in vibrant shades of red and gold, the community garden project faced its first real challenge. An early frost warning threatened the remaining harvest, and the neighborhood sprang into action in a way that would have been unimaginable just months ago. Patricia's phone, once used to report suspicions, now buzzed constantly with messages from concerned garden volunteers. Christopher, returning from his shift at the police station, found her organizing an emergency response team in her living room, surrounded by garden maps and weather reports. "We've got tarps and old bed sheets from half the neighborhood," Patricia explained, looking up from her planning. "But we'll need all hands on deck tonight if we want to save the late season." Vegetables. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the garden layout with the same attention she once used to monitor suspicious activities. Christopher immediately called the station, arranging for off-duty officers to help. "You know," he said with a smile, "this is probably the first time we've had a police response team deployed to protect tomatoes and peppers." As evening approached, Cedar Heights transformed into a hive of activity. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before the garden project now worked shoulder to shoulder, stretching protective covers over precious plants. Young Tommy, now the garden's unofficial junior manager, directed traffic with the authority of a seasoned gardener. "Careful with those pumpkins," he called out, clipboard in hand. "They're for the community Halloween party." Patricia watched him with pride, remembering the shy boy who'd first asked about growing tomatoes. Under the glow of hastily assembled work lights, the true spirit of the transformed community showed itself. The retired doctor brought hot coffee for the volunteers. Mrs. Lee coordinated warm food deliveries from neighbors who couldn't help physically. Even the local high school's environmental club showed up, having heard about the emergency through social media. As they worked, Christopher observed how naturally everyone fell into cooperation. "It's amazing," he mentioned to Patricia as they secured a corner of tarp, how the same people who once watched each other with suspicion now watch out for each other. Patricia nodded, her breath visible in the cooling air. You know what's even more amazing? I used to think I was protecting the neighborhood by keeping watch. Now I realize true protection comes from connection, not isolation. The night grew colder, but the work continued. Stories and laughter flowed as freely as the hot chocolate being passed around. Someone started singing, and soon others joined in. The garden, their shared achievement, had become worth protecting not just for its produce, but for what it represented. Around midnight, with the last of the protective covers secured, the volunteers gathered in Patricia's warm kitchen. Her home, once a fortress of solitude, now buzzed with conversation and camaraderie. Christopher noticed how comfortable she seemed in this new role, community matriarch rather than neighborhood watchdog. I've been thinking, Patricia announced, addressing the tired but satisfied group. We should turn this challenge into an opportunity. Why not start a winter garden program? We could use my greenhouse and teach children about year-round growing. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval. The local science teacher immediately offered to integrate it into her curriculum. Parents spoke up about how the garden had already improved their children's eating habits and understanding of nature. As the impromptu meeting continued, Christopher pulled Patricia aside. You've come a long way from calling the police on your new neighbor, he said softly, both of them able to laugh about it now. And you've come a long way from being the suspicious man moving in, she replied with a twinkle in her eye. Though I must say, you're still suspicious, suspiciously good at bringing people together. The next morning, as the sun rose over Cedar Heights, the garden stood protected under its patchwork of covers, a visual representation of the community's unified effort. The frost had come as predicted, coating uncovered grass with crystalline white, but under the tarps, the garden's warmth persisted. News of the night's activities spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. Local media picked up the story again, but this time, it wasn't about overcoming prejudice, it was about a community coming together to protect something they all held dear. As Patricia and Christopher inspected the garden in the early morning light, they found not a single plant lost to the frost. Their success was more than just agricultural, it was proof that their community had grown strong enough to weather any storm, literal or metaphorical. You know what this reminds me of? Christopher said, lifting a corner of tarp to check on the plants. It's like that first day when you called the police. We could have let that frost our relationship permanently. Instead, look what grew from it. Patricia smiled, watching as the morning sun began to melt the frost around them. The garden, like their community, had proven resilient in the face of adversity. And she, like the plants they'd protected, had grown in ways she never expected. As winter approached Cedar Heights, the community garden success story caught the attention of the state governor's office. They selected the neighborhood as the location for launching a new statewide community integration initiative. The announcement brought both excitement and nervous anticipation to the residents, particularly Patricia and Christopher. Can you believe it? Patricia asked, arranging photos of the garden's transformation for the upcoming presentation. A year ago, I was calling the police on you. Now we're showing the governor how to build better communities. She shook her head in amazement as she sorted through pictures showing the garden's growth from empty lot to thriving community space. Christopher, helping to set up chairs in the community center, smiled at the irony. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons, he replied, remembering their journey. The community center, once barely used, now bustled with activity as neighbors prepared for the governor's visit. Young Tommy burst through the door, his winter coat dusted with snow. Mrs. Henderson. Chief Reynolds. You need to see this. He grabbed their hands, pulling them toward the garden. Despite the winter chill, they followed his excitement. There, in the snow-covered garden, stood a surprise that brought tears to Patricia's eyes. The neighborhood children had worked in secret, creating ice sculptures along the garden paths. Each sculpture represented a different moment in their community's transformation, from the police cars arriving that first day to the current scene of children and adults working together in the garden. "We wanted to show the governor the whole story," Tommy explained proudly. "Because Mrs. Henderson says every garden has a story to tell." The day of the governor's visit arrived with fresh snow and clear skies. The community center filled with residents, local officials, and media representatives. Patricia, dressed in her best gardening apron covered with commemorative pins from various community events, stood nervously beside Christopher in his formal police uniform. The governor listened intently as they shared their story, not just of a garden's growth, but of a community's transformation. Patricia spoke about her journey from fear to fellowship, her voice strong and clear. Christopher explained how traditional policing evolved into community partnership, creating a model that other departments were eager to study. "What strikes me most," the governor commented, walking through the winter garden with its ice sculptures, "is how you've turned an incident that could have deepened divisions into a foundation for unity. This isn't just about growing vegetables, it's about growing understanding." During the tour, they stopped at the friendship bench, now adorned with winter evergreen garlands. A small heating lamp had been installed nearby, making it usable even in cold weather. "This bench," Patricia explained, "has heard more stories of reconciliation and connection than any of us could count." The governor sat on the bench, inviting Patricia and Christopher to join her. "Tell me," she asked, "what's the most important lesson you've learned from all this?" Patricia looked at Christopher, then at the gathered community members. "We learned that safety isn't about keeping people out," she began. "It's about letting people in, into our neighborhoods, our gardens, and our hearts." Christopher nodded. "And we learned that real change doesn't happen through force or fear," he added. "It happens through understanding and opportunity." As if to emphasize their point, young Tommy appeared with a group of children, carrying trays of hot chocolate made with mint grown in their garden's herb section. The governor accepted a cup, noting how the children moved comfortably among the adults, confident in their role as community members. Later that evening, after the official events had ended, the community gathered for a winter feast in the heated greenhouse. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes made from preserved garden produce, Patricia's famous tomato sauce, Mrs. Lee's pickled vegetables, and countless other recipes that had become neighborhood favorites. As conversations flowed and children played between the tables, Christopher found Patricia standing quietly by the greenhouse windows, watching snow fall on their beloved garden. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, joining her. "I was just thinking," she replied, "about how much I've gained by letting go of fear. This garden, it's given me more than I ever had when I was trying to keep people away." Outside, the ice sculptures glittered in the evening light, telling their story of transformation. The garden, though dormant under its winter blanket, still pulsed with life and promise. Like the community it had helped build, it would grow again in spring, stronger for having weathered the cold together. As spring approached Cedar Heights once again, the neighborhood prepared to celebrate the one-year anniversary of their transformative journey. The garden, awakening from its winter slumber, symbolized more than just seasonal renewal. It marked a complete cycle of change that had revolutionized their community. Patricia stood in her kitchen, baking her signature lemon squares for the celebration, while watching the morning's activities through her window. But unlike a year ago, her gaze held warmth and anticipation rather than suspicion. Outside, Christopher coordinated with volunteers setting up tables and chairs around the flourishing community garden. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Mrs. Lee asked, entering Patricia's kitchen with a tray of her famous spring rolls. The two women, once divided by the incident, now shared a deep friendship. The governor's office called again. "They want to feature our story in the state's new community building handbook." The celebration was set to be their biggest gathering yet. News crews from across the state had arrived to document what they called the Cedar Heights model, a blueprint for transforming community conflicts into opportunities for growth. But for the residents, it was simply a chance to celebrate their shared journey. Tommy, now a confident young community leader, directed a group of children in hanging banners between the garden trellises. "Mrs. Henderson," he called out as Patricia approached with her lemon squares. "We've got a surprise for you and Chief Reynolds, but you can't see it until the ceremony." The garden had evolved beyond anyone's expectations. Raised beds burst with early spring flowers and vegetables, while the greenhouse hosted educational programs for schools across the district. The friendship bench, now surrounded by blooming heritage roses, had become a symbol of their transformation, featured in community building workshops nationwide. As afternoon approached, residents gathered in the garden. Christopher, standing at the makeshift podium, looked out at the faces before him, no longer strangers, but family. "A year ago," he began, "I moved into this neighborhood with nothing but boxes and hope. What happened next could have driven us apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways none of us could have imagined." Patricia joined him at the podium, her eyes moist with emotion. "I stand before you today not as the person who made that regrettable phone call, but as someone who learned that the best way to protect a community is to nurture it. Like our garden, we grow stronger when we grow together." The surprise Tommy had mentioned was revealed: a new community center building adjacent to the garden, converted from an old storage facility. Inside, walls displayed photos documenting their journey, from the first uncomfortable encounters to the present day of harmony and shared purpose. "This space," Tommy announced proudly, "will be called the Growth Center, because Mrs. Henderson taught us that growth isn't just for plants, it's for people too." As evening approached, the celebration continued under strings of garden lights. Children played between the garden rows while adults shared meals and stories. The police officers who had responded to Patricia's call that first day now sat with her, sharing laughs over plates of garden-fresh food. Near sunset, Christopher found Patricia sitting on the friendship bench, watching the celebration. "You know," he said, joining her, "when I was appointed police chief, I wanted to make a difference in the community. I never expected it would happen quite like this." Patricia smiled, watching as a group of new residents were welcomed warmly by their neighbors. "We all want to feel safe in our homes," she reflected. "I just didn't understand that real safety comes from connection, not isolation." As the stars began to appear above Cedar Heights, the garden stood as a living testament to their journey. The once empty lot had become the heart of their community, producing not just vegetables and flowers, but understanding, friendship, and hope. The story of the suspicious neighbor and the new police chief had evolved into something far greater, a blueprint for community transformation that would inspire others for years to come. In Cedar Heights, they had learned that the strongest fences aren't the ones that keep people out, but the bonds that bring people together. As the celebration wound down, Tommy placed a small plaque at the garden's entrance. It read, "Welcome to the Cedar Heights Community Garden, where strangers become family." Below it, in smaller letters, "Remember, growth begins with an open heart." Patricia and Christopher stood together, reading the plaque in the gentle evening light. Their story had come full circle, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest moments of understanding. The garden would continue to grow, just as their community would continue to evolve, nourished by the roots of acceptance, understanding, and connection they had planted together. The night ended with neighbors departing arm in arm, their paths lit by the same garden lights that had illuminated their journey. From suspicion to solidarity. In Cedar Heights, they had discovered that the best way to protect a community wasn't through fear and division, but through nurturing the seeds of understanding and watching them grow into something beautiful.